"Excuse me, are you here for the emergency guardianship consultation?" The court clerk asked loudly across the crowded probate office waiting area, where I'd been sitting for 20 minutes, waiting to meet with my daughter Jessica about what she'd called routine estate planning paperwork. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward me as I sat holding the appointment confirmation Jessica had given me, surrounded by other families dealing with what appeared to be similar elderly care situations. People in business attire stared with mixture of sympathy and recognition, watching what seemed to be another family managing an elderly relative's declining capacity. "Dad, I'm so glad you made it," Jessica said, approaching from the clerk's desk, where she'd apparently been finalizing documentation with her husband, Derek. "I know this seems overwhelming, but we're just taking care of some legal protections for your welfare." Behind the clerk's station, 3 court officers observed the situation, while other families waited their turn for similar proceedings. Several people were discreetly taking notes, probably learning from what they assumed was a routine guardianship appointment. "He's been showing concerning signs lately," Jessica explained to the gathering crowd, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who'd rehearsed this explanation. "Memory problems, confusion about financial matters, difficulty understanding complex legal documents. We're working with his doctor to ensure proper safeguards." I stayed quiet, gripping my wallet that contained cards Jessica had never seen. They mistook my silence for weakness. But Jessica didn't know who I was. She didn't know that I'd spent 42 years as a federal probate judge, presiding over thousands of guardianship cases and elder protection proceedings. She didn't know that I understood every legal maneuver she was attempting, every procedural requirement she was trying to manipulate. And this didn't start today. It started 3 weeks ago when Jessica began mentioning my declining cognitive function during family dinners. But the real warning had come this morning when my banker sent me an urgent text that would change everything. And that was only the beginning. The text message had arrived at 7:23 a.m. while I was drinking coffee in my kitchen, trying to understand why Jessica had suddenly become so concerned about my estate planning needs. My phone buzzed with a message from David Chen, my personal banker at First National for the past 18 years. "Come now. Emergency at bank. Jessica filed guardianship papers yesterday. Don't tell her we talked. Office 9 a.m. sharp." I stared at the screen, reading the message 3 times before the implications hit me. Guardianship papers meant Jessica was trying to have me declared legally incompetent, seeking court authority over my finances, my property, my medical decisions, essentially my entire life. I should have noticed the first sign 3 weeks. Earlier, when Jessica started asking unusually detailed questions about my daily routine, my medication schedule, and whether I'd been experiencing any memory problems since my wife Margaret had passed away 2 years ago. But I'd been grateful for her attention, interpreting her concern as loving care for her aging father. Jessica had been visiting more frequently, always with Derek, always asking about my financial accounts, my investment portfolio, my estate planning. She'd brought forms for me to sign, explaining they were just routine updates to ensure my affairs were properly organized. "Dad, you know how complicated these financial matters can get," she'd said during one visit, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "It would really help if I had some legal authority to assist you with banking and investment decisions." What I didn't realize was that Jessica was systematically gathering information needed to support claims of my incompetence while building a case for emergency guardianship. She'd been documenting my supposed confusion about financial matters, creating a narrative of cognitive decline that would justify court intervention. But Jessica had made a critical miscalculation about her target. She'd seen a 76-year-old widower living quietly in suburban retirement and assumed I lacked the legal expertise to recognize sophisticated guardianship manipulation. She had no idea that I'd spent 4 decades presiding over cases exactly like this one, protecting vulnerable elderly people from family members who exploited guardianship laws for financial gain. I should have noticed the first sign. That morning at David's office brought terrible clarity when he showed me copies of the guardianship petition Jessica had filed with the probate court, documentation that activated every judicial instinct I'd developed during 42 years on the federal bench. What David didn't know was that I wasn't just a retired federal employee. I was the Honorable Charles Morrison, former chief probate judge for the Eastern District. I'd spent 4 decades presiding over complex guardianship cases, including hundreds of proceedings involving family exploitation and elder financial abuse. I'd overseen guardianship hearings where adult children attempted to gain control over elderly parents' assets through fraudulent claims of incompetence. I understood every legal requirement, every procedural safeguard, every tactic that unscrupulous petitioners used to manipulate the guardianship system. But I'd retired 5 years ago, choosing quiet suburban life after Margaret passed away. She'd been my anchor for 48 years, and without her, I'd felt disconnected from the legal community that had once defined my professional identity. Jessica had seen my grief and withdrawal from social activities, calculating that a retired federal judge would be vulnerable to legal manipulation when isolated and emotionally compromised. She'd researched my financial assets, but had never investigated my judicial background or the extensive legal network I'd maintained. Margaret had always been proud of my work protecting vulnerable people from guardianship abuse. She'd attended judicial conferences where I'd presented papers on procedural reforms, elder protection statutes, and systematic approaches to preventing exactly what Jessica was attempting. Jessica was about to learn that targeting a retired federal probate judge for guardianship fraud was the most expensive mistake of her legal career. But the real shock came later that morning when I began examining the documentation Jessica had submitted to support her petition for emergency guardianship. That morning felt heavier when David showed me evidence that Jessica had been systematically documenting my supposed cognitive decline while researching legal procedures for gaining complete control over everything Margaret and I had accumulated during 48 years of marriage. Someone has been photographing your routine activities, recording your daily schedule, and creating detailed reports of what they're calling concerning behavioral patterns, David explained, spreading documents across his desk. They've also contacted your primary care physician, requesting evaluations for dementia and cognitive impairment. But the behavioral documentation was only part of Jessica's plan. David had discovered that the guardianship petition included requests for immediate authority over my house, my federal pension, my investment accounts, and the trust fund I'd established for my grandchildren's education. The petition claims, "You've been exhibiting signs of severe memory loss, making dangerous financial decisions, and expressing paranoid beliefs about family members trying to exploit you," David continued, his voice heavy with professional concern. "They've submitted sworn affidavits from multiple witnesses describing incidents of confusion and inappropriate behavior. Jessica intended to have me declared legally incompetent within days, then gain court-ordered authority over every aspect of my life. She'd calculated that an elderly widower wouldn't understand the legal complexities involved in challenging emergency guardianship proceedings. What Jessica was really targeting was my $1.2 million retirement portfolio and the house Margaret and I had spent 48 years paying off. Combined with my federal pension and Margaret's life insurance policy, she stood to control nearly $2 million in assets. "There's something else you need to see," David said, pulling out additional documentation. "They've researched assisted living facilities that specialize in housing individuals with court-appointed guardians, along with fee structures for ongoing asset management. The scope of betrayal was breathtaking. Jessica had been planning to institutionalize me while liquidating my assets, probably using guardianship authority to transfer my property to herself while claiming it was necessary for my care. But Jessica had made a fundamental miscalculation about her target. She'd seen a 76-year-old retired man living quietly after his wife's death and assumed I lacked the legal expertise to recognize systematic guardianship fraud. She'd never considered that some quiet old men had spent their careers presiding over thousands of these cases, understanding every procedural requirement, every legal safeguard, every tactic used by family members who exploited vulnerable elderly relatives. He had no idea who he was dealing with. But Jessica made her critical mistake when she submitted medical documentation claiming I'd been diagnosed with progressive dementia, using forged letterhead from Dr. Anderson's office without his knowledge or consent. The fraudulent medical reports triggered verification procedures that exposed her entire scheme. The medical records Jessica submitted contained diagnostic language and billing codes that Dr. Anderson has never used in his practice, David explained. showing me side-by-side comparisons of authentic and fabricated documents. More importantly, the signatures don't match his actual handwriting samples on file with our medical insurance verification system. As a federal probate judge, I'd reviewed thousands of medical evaluations in guardianship cases. Jessica's forgeries were sophisticated, but contained subtle errors that any experienced judge would immediately recognize. Incorrect terminology, improper formatting, and authentication procedures that didn't match standard medical practices. There's something else, David continued, his voice filled with professional outrage. The person who submitted these documents also attempted to access your safe deposit box yesterday, claiming emergency authority under guardianship proceedings that haven't even been approved yet. The level of premeditation was staggering. Jessica had spent months building a comprehensive case for my incompetence while creating fraudulent documentation to support expedited guardianship proceedings. She'd researched guardianship law extensively, but had made critical procedural errors. I've contacted the court clerk's office, David explained. The case has been flagged for detailed judicial review due to irregularities in the supporting medical documentation and the unusually expedited timeline. Jessica had left a paper trail that any competent legal professional could follow directly to criminal charges. Her paralegal background had given her knowledge of court procedures, but she'd forgotten that guardianship cases involving federal retirees receive enhanced scrutiny. She was about to learn that attempting guardianship fraud against a former federal probate judge was the most expensive mistake of her criminal career. That mistake cost him everything. And I knew the trap was closing around Jessica when David introduced me to Detective Williams from the Elder Abuse Division and Attorney Patricia from the State Attorney General's office. The investigation had expanded rapidly once court officials noticed irregularities in Jessica's expedited guardianship petition. Mr. Charles, we've discovered that your daughter has created an extensive infrastructure for gaining fraudulent control over your estate through manipulated guardianship proceedings, Detective Williams explained. Forged medical records, false witness statements, and systematic documentation designed to support emergency incompetence claims. The evidence was overwhelming and sophisticated. Jessica had enlisted Derek's help in photographing my daily activities while creating a false narrative of cognitive decline. She'd even contacted former colleagues, claiming urgent concern about my mental deterioration. We've also found correspondence between Jessica and asset management firms that specialize in liquidating estates under guardianship authority, Attorney Patricia added. The plan appears to have been systematic. Gain emergency guardianship, institutionalize you immediately, and begin asset liquidation within weeks. David spread additional evidence across his desk. Screenshots of Jessica's internet research, copies of facility brochures she'd had downloaded, correspondence with liquidation specialists and guardianship attorneys who advertised expedited proceedings for difficult family situations. Her plan was remarkably detailed, Detective Williams noted. File emergency petition using forged medical evidence, gain temporary authority within days, move you to secured care facility, and begin systematic asset transfer while maintaining legal control indefinitely. But what Jessica didn't understand was that she'd targeted someone with intimate knowledge of exactly these types of criminal schemes. I'd presided over similar cases for decades, understood every technique she was using, recognized every pattern in her fraudulent behavior. The investigation had also revealed that Jessica's law firm had been researching guardianship procedures for other elderly clients, suggesting a broader pattern of elder exploitation that extended beyond my case. The trap was almost ready. That evening felt surreal when Jessica called to check on my emotional readiness for tomorrow's court appointment, her voice carrying the same caring tone she'd used for weeks while systematically planning to destroy my independence and steal my assets. Hi, Dad. I just wanted to make sure you understand what's happening tomorrow. The guardianship hearing is really just a formality to ensure you're protected from making harmful financial decisions. I could hear the confidence in her voice. Jessica was probably reviewing her final preparations, calculating how quickly she could gain legal control once the court granted her emergency authority over my affairs. Actually, Jessica, I had some very interesting conversations today, I replied calmly. With my banker, with some investigators, with an attorney from the state attorney general's office. There was a long pause before she responded, and I could practically hear her mental gears shifting as she tried to assess whether her guardianship scheme had been detected by law enforcement. Dad, that sounds concerning. What kind of investigators? The kind who specialize in guardianship fraud, elder exploitation, and forged medical records. They seemed very interested in your petition and the medical documentation you submitted to support your claims. Jessica's breathing had become rapid and shallow. She was realizing that her months of criminal planning had been completely uncovered by investigators who understood guardianship law far better than she did. Dad, I think you might be confused about the purpose of these proceedings, Jessica said desperately. The guardianship is designed to protect you from exactly this kind of paranoid thinking. Maybe Derek and I should come over so we can discuss this calmly. But her voice was shaking now. Jessica understood that her criminal enterprise was collapsing, that law enforcement agencies were probably preparing arrest warrants while we spoke. She was losing control. That night, the calm before Jessica's destruction felt heavy with disappointment in my own daughter and rage at her calculated betrayal of everything Margaret and I had tried to teach her about family loyalty and human dignity. I sat in the study where Margaret and I had spent countless evenings discussing legal cases, reviewing the comprehensive evidence file the investigators had assembled about Jessica's systematic fraud. The investigation had revealed that Jessica's scheme was even more extensive than initially discovered. Over 6 months, she'd created false documentation, enlisted Derek as an accomplice, and built infrastructure for liquidating my entire estate while maintaining guardianship authority indefinitely. Mr. Charles, Detective Williams had explained during our final briefing, your daughter's computer contains detailed research into secured memory care facilities in remote locations, far from anyone who might question her guardianship decisions or advocate for your welfare. The evidence painted a picture of calculated cruelty that went beyond simple financial theft. Jessica had been planning to destroy my life completely, steal my assets, sell my house, have me declared legally incompetent, and warehouse me in institutional care where I'd never be able to expose her crimes. I thought about Margaret, who'd been so proud of Jessica's law school graduation, her paralegal career, her apparent dedication to helping families navigate complex legal situations. Margaret had believed we'd raised a daughter with strong moral principles. Tomorrow morning, state and federal agents would arrest Jessica on charges that would send her to prison for decades. Derek would discover that his wife was a criminal who'd been planning to destroy her own father for money. But I wanted Jessica to understand exactly who she'd chosen to victimize, exactly what judicial expertise she'd attempted to manipulate before her arrest ended any possibility of family reconciliation forever. Tomorrow, everything would change. But the confrontation came quietly when I arrived at the scheduled guardianship hearing, ostensibly to comply with the court proceedings Jessica had arranged. Her relief was obvious as she approached the courtroom, probably calculating that legal formalities would soon grant her complete control over my life and assets. Dad, I'm so glad you're being cooperative about this process, Jessica began, settling beside Derek at the petitioner's table, while court staff prepared for what they believed was a routine emergency guardianship hearing. The courtroom was filled with other families dealing with similar proceedings, and Jessica had positioned herself as the concerned daughter, protecting her vulnerable father from his own declining judgment. Your Honor, my father has been exhibiting clear signs of cognitive impairment that make him vulnerable to financial exploitation, Jessica told the judge, consulting her carefully prepared notes. We're seeking emergency guardianship authority to protect his assets and ensure appropriate medical care. I looked at her calmly across the courtroom, where I'd once presided over thousands of similar cases. Jessica, before the court considers your petition, there are some people I'd like you to meet. The courtroom doors opened, and Detective Williams entered, followed by Agent Patricia from the FBI's Elder Exploitation Unit and Attorney Michael from the State Attorney General's office. Their badges were clearly visible as they approached the bench. Your Honor, Detective Williams announced, we need to halt these proceedings. Ms. Jessica Morrison is under federal investigation for guardianship fraud, elder abuse, and filing false documents with this court. The courtroom went completely silent. Other families stopped their conversations. The court reporter paused mid-sentence. Jessica's face went from confident to terrified in seconds. I simply folded my hands in my lap and smiled quietly. "Ms. Morrison," Agent Patricia announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, filing fraudulent court documents, and attempting to defraud a federal retiree." Jessica looked at me with growing horror as she began to understand the magnitude of her miscalculation. "You're not just a retired federal employee," she whispered. "Chief probate judge, 42 years presiding over guardianship fraud cases exactly like this one." She realized what I truly was, and justice came quietly that afternoon when federal agents completed Jessica's arrest on multiple felony charges. Detective Williams called to inform me that Jessica had been charged with 16 federal counts related to her elaborate guardianship fraud scheme. Jessica Morrison is facing 15 to 20 years in federal prison, Detective Williams explained. The systematic nature of the fraud, the targeting of a federal retiree, and the forged medical documentation carry enhanced penalties under federal elder protection statutes. The asset forfeiture proceedings had frozen Jessica's accounts and her law firm's client trust funds pending investigation. The inquiry had revealed that she'd been researching similar schemes involving other elderly clients, suggesting a pattern of systematic elder exploitation. Derek was charged as a co-conspirator, but received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. He genuinely believed Jessica's claims about my mental decline until investigators showed him the evidence of her systematic deception. The hardest part was explaining to my grandchildren that they wouldn't see their mother for 15 years, that the college funds Margaret and I had established for them were safe only because we'd caught Jessica before she could liquidate them through fraudulent guardianship authority. 6 months later, I accepted an invitation to speak at a national judicial conference about guardianship reform, using Jessica's case as an example of how sophisticated criminals exploit procedural weaknesses in elder protection systems. Margaret would have been proud that I'd used this terrible experience to help protect other families. The federal charges ensured that Jessica would spend most of her remaining productive years in environments where her legal knowledge and manipulation skills would prove entirely ineffective. Other elderly victims would be protected from her predatory expertise. Sometimes the quietest revenge is simply allowing the justice system to function as it was designed. Jessica had calculated that an elderly widower would be easy prey for sophisticated guardianship fraud, even when that widower happened to be a retired federal judge. She'd learned too late that judicial retirement doesn't mean loss of legal expertise, and that some fathers carry 40 years of courtroom experience that turn family betrayal into federal prison sentences. But justice in federal court stays silent, patient, and inevitable as Margaret's memory.